I walked through my own front door, still smelling like the champagne my unit had poured over my new silver eagle after 22 years, my daughter's small hand warm in mine. I expected to find my husband waiting with pride in his eyes. Instead, I found divorce papers fanned across the kitchen island like a hand of cards, my husband standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, and the word soldier thrown at me like an insult instead of the title I'd bled for. I didn't cry. I smiled because they had no idea whose house they were standing in. The ceremony that morning had been simple, the way the army does things when it matters most. No fireworks, just a room full of people who understood exactly what the new rank on my shoulders had cost me. 22 years of deployments, missed birthdays, reheated Thanksgiving dinners, learning to sleep through mortar fire, and then worse, learning to sleep through silence when I came home and the house felt too quiet. Colonel. My commanding general pinned the eagle himself and shook my hand a beat longer than protocol required. Elizabeth, he said, you earned every bit of this the hard way. I thanked him and meant it, but my mind had already left the room, thinking about Daniel's face when I told him, about Emily jumping up and down the way she does when she's proud of someone she loves. I kept it inside, folded neat the way I fold everything that matters too much to risk saying wrong. I picked Emily up from school at 3:15, still in uniform, the fabric stiff with its new insignia. She came running, backpack bouncing, ponytail flying loose. "Mommy, you look different," she said, studying the eagle like a puzzle. "Is that new?" I explained it, crouching to her height, and her eyes went wide. Colonel, the highest rank I'd ever imagined when I was 18 and signing enlistment papers against my mother's wishes. Emily didn't understand military hierarchy, but she understood pride. "We have to celebrate," she announced, tugging my hand toward the car. "Can we get the little cakes with strawberries?" We stopped at the bakery on Maple Street and picked 2 small cakes. Emily carried the box the whole ride home, narrating Daniel's imagined reaction. "Daddy will be so proud of you," she said more than once. "He's going to say you're the toughest mom in America." I let her believe it, because at that point I still believed it too. Whatever had gone cold between Daniel and me over the last year, the phones angled from view, the distance I hadn't let myself name. We pulled into the driveway a little after 5. The porch light was already on, and there was a car I didn't recognize, dealer plate still on it. Emily was already unbuckling, chattering about candles, even though it wasn't a birthday. I noticed. 2 decades of reading rooms before you walk into them doesn't switch off just because you're home. Daniel stood in the doorway before I'd gotten my key out, beside him a woman in a fitted blazer, dark hair pulled back, an expression like she'd rehearsed this and was pleased with how it was going. On the island behind them sat a manila folder, thick enough that I knew what it was before anyone spoke. "Elizabeth," Daniel said, "no hello, no mention of the eagle on my collar which he'd noticed, whatever else he was. This marriage is over." Emily's grip on my hand tightened before her mind caught up to what was wrong. The woman beside him, Vanessa, looked me up and down like furniture about to be hauled away. "Pack your bags, soldier," she said, smiling like she'd waited all day to say it. I could have argued. Instead I looked past them, past the folder, past 20 years of memory stacked in every room of that house, and something in me went very still, the same stillness I'd learned in briefings where the wrong reaction could cost lives. "Okay," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile faltered. "Actually," I said, almost gentle, "this house belongs to—" Daniel laughed before I could finish, cutting me off like my sentence wasn't worth completing. He had no idea he'd just made the last mistake of his marriage. "The house is mine after the divorce," he said, flat and certain. "You can take your things and go, Elizabeth." Vanessa didn't wait for an invitation, walking the house like she already owned it, fingertips on the banister, judging the paint, the bookshelves, the photo of Emily's first day of kindergarten on the mantel. I let her keep walking. I didn't argue. I took Emily upstairs away from the noise and helped her pack her rabbit, a sweater, an unfinished drawing. She watched my face for cues. "Are we leaving, Mommy?" she whispered. "Just for tonight," I told her, which was true, though not the way she imagined. Before we left, I went to the fireproof safe in my closet floor, the one Daniel had never once asked about in 11 years, and removed a folder I'd kept since before our vows. He watched from the hallway with the smug patience of a man who thought he'd already won. I didn't correct him. I set my house key on the counter beside the divorce papers. "Enjoy your evening," I said, and meant it more than they understood. Emily and I checked into a hotel near the base. She fell asleep fast. I lay awake, not out of grief but clarity. 22 years teaches you to separate emotion from action. Grieve later, move now. So I made phone calls instead of crying. Back at the house, Daniel and Vanessa celebrated like the war was already won, Champagne opened in my kitchen, Vanessa already talking paint colors for the guest room. Neither knew that dream had an expiration measured in hours. The next morning a process server arrived at 9:00 sharp, timed by calls I'd made the night before. Daniel answered in his robe expecting a package. Instead, a legal notice 3 pages from an attorney I'd retained years earlier for exactly this contingency, stating plainly that the house was titled solely in my name, purchased and paid for before our marriage, and therefore not marital property. Daniel called 11 times before noon. I didn't answer. By afternoon, Vanessa had read it over his shoulder and gone pale, then loud. "Impossible," she said, snatching the papers as if she could argue with a title deed. It was 11 years of quiet decisions Daniel had never bothered to ask about, arriving all at once. The truth came out slowly, not because I'd hidden it, but because he'd never asked the right questions. Years before we met as a captain overseas, I'd used deployment bonuses and disciplined saving to buy the house through an estate sale, back when the market there was still affordable. My safety net long before Daniel, my quiet insurance against a world that doesn't always treat single women in uniform kindly. When we married and moved in together, he simply assumed because I never corrected him and he never asked that we'd bought it jointly. I let him believe it because it never occurred to me the truth would someday matter this much. He finally reached me on the 4th day, mostly because Emily kept asking why Daddy sounded so upset on voicemails she wasn't supposed to hear. "You let me think it was ours," he said angry, though he didn't apologize for the papers or Vanessa or however many months this had been building. "You never asked whose name was on the deed, Daniel. In 11 years you never once asked." He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. 2 weeks in, Daniel discovered our joint checking account held barely a month of bills and demanded to know where our money had gone. It had always been exactly what it sounded like. Shared every day, never where my real savings lived. For 15 years I'd quietly built a financial life of my own, deployment pay into index funds, housing allowances into dividend stocks, and a small rental duplex near the base. None of it was hidden, it simply wasn't his and he'd never once asked if it existed. "You let me think we were struggling," he said, and I nearly laughed, given he was the one who'd walked in with divorce papers and a girlfriend. "I never told you we were struggling. You told yourself a story and I let you keep believing it." For 11 years he'd assumed he was the more capable partner, the provider, the one who understood money. Now he was learning otherwise. Vanessa's reaction was worse. She'd signed on for a successful executive, a valuable house, an upgrade. Watching it dissolve eroded whatever patience she had left. A neighbor mentioned raised voices some evenings. "You told me she was just some soldier who'd be easy to walk over," she reportedly said. "I felt very little about any of it. I focused on Emily instead, keeping her routine steady. She asked once why Daddy sounded so tired. Grown-up things, I told her, not a lie, just an incomplete truth." The courtroom was small, beige fluorescent. I wore my service uniform not for effect but because it was simply who I was. Daniel arrived with Curtis, his attorney, both in suits too new to be familiar. Judge Rebecca Hill reviewed the file and looked up. "Good morning, Colonel Carter." Custody moved quickly, given Emily's stated wishes, and then came the house. Curtis argued the length of the marriage, Daniel's financial contributions, a vague fairness that didn't hold against a title deed dated 8 months before our wedding. My attorney, Patricia Reyes, simply laid out the documents: purchase agreement, closing statement, mortgage payoff, all in my name, predating the marriage by nearly a year. Then she called Margaret Lawson, who'd sold me the house years ago. Margaret walked to the stand with a cane, her voice still sharp. She'd sold it to me privately, well below market, because I'd just come back from my 3rd deployment and she recognized the exhaustion. Her late husband had served 2 tours in Vietnam. "I made sure every document was airtight in her name alone," she said, "because I wanted her to have something no one could take from her." I hadn't known that part. Daniel's face went the color of old paper. Curtis didn't bother cross-examining, there was nothing to shake. Judge Hill did not take long deciding. The house was separate property, no marital claim existed. She granted the divorce primary custody to me, generous visitation for Daniel contingent on consistency, and confirmed the house as solely mine. Daniel stared at a fixed point on the table, wearing an expression I recognized from my own briefing rooms, when a mission fell apart in a single sentence. I walked out to the parking lot, where Emily waited with her grandmother, unaware that the last uncertain piece of our future had just been settled. Daniel used nearly all 30 days to move out. Vanessa didn't wait for the deadline. She left within a week, her unpacked boxes loaded by movers who weren't Daniel no goodbye. Daniel's firm valued discretion, and a messy divorce involving a colonel, a mistress, and an 80-year-old attorney's testimony drew more attention than his employers liked. I took no satisfaction in his losses. 22 years in uniform teaches you revenge is rarely clean. I had Emily, and a house paid for and secure, and I'd stopped measuring my life against his the moment I walked out of that kitchen holding my daughter's hand. What I insisted on through Patricia was structure. Daniel could see Emily on schedule provided he behaved like a father instead of performing fatherhood for an audience. Weeks after the ruling, Emily asked me, cross-legged on her bedroom floor, "Mom, are we really okay? Like actually okay?" I sat beside her. "We are finally free," I told her, and felt the truth of it settle in my chest, not free from difficulty, but free from the version of our life that required me to shrink myself, to let assumptions go uncorrected, to accept being underestimated as the price of peace in my own home. The first weekend after Daniel finished moving out, Emily and I painted her room a pale green she'd chosen herself, both of us in old army t-shirts, paint on our hands, laughing when she caught my sleeve with a stray brushstroke. It felt more like home than 11 years of trying to make a marriage work in those same rooms had ever felt. Neighbours began stopping by, not for the gossip, but out of something more generous. Old colleagues came to help assemble a bookshelf. Colonel David Morgan, retiring after nearly 30 years, stood in my rearranged living room and said, "Some people think rank is earned on the battlefield. Sometimes it's earned by surviving life with dignity." I didn't have a response right away. It settled into me differently than any medal ever had. That evening, I hung the framed photo from my promotion ceremony in the hallway, not as a trophy, just a reminder of what that day had actually meant. The real victory hadn't been the house or the money, or watching Daniel's carefully built version of himself come apart. It was smaller and steadier. Emily sleeping soundly upstairs in a room she'd chosen herself, a home that finally fully belonged to the people who lived in it with honesty. Daniel sent a handwritten letter months later, careful, clearly drafted more than once. He apologized sincerely enough that I believed him, said he understood what he'd thrown away, and hoped someday to be the father Emily deserved. I wrote back 3 sentences, thanking him for the honesty, confirming the visitation schedule, wishing him well. Some doors don't need to be slammed to stay closed. They just need to be left quietly in the past, while you walk forward into whatever you're building instead. The day they told me to pack my bags, they thought they were taking my home. They never realized I'd been carrying my real home beside me all along, holding my daughter's hand, all the way back to a house that had been mine before either of them ever walked through its door.